The oldest member of the McMullen family tree is Nicholas Fitzsimons, born in 1764 in Downpatrick, Northern Ireland. He was my 3 times great-grandfather, and surprisingly, he died in Wollongong more than 90 years later, having spent a number of years on the Ballarat goldfields while he was in his early 90s. In 1806, when he was 42, Nicholas married, and like many poor Irish from Northern Ireland at this time, he moved to Glasgow looking for work. Shortly after arriving in Glasgow, his eldest daughter Roseanne, my great-great-grandmother, was born. Soon after, 2 more children were born, but in 1814, when Roseanne was only 7, her mother died, leaving a young family for Nicholas to support. The family lived in one of the poorest parts of Glasgow, in a community of rented houses for weavers at the nearby cotton mill on the River Clyde. Nicholas was a handloom weaver at the mill and would have worked on machines like this one. Within a year of his wife's death, Nicholas had married again, and with his new wife, he was to have 5 more children over the next 15 years. Like their father, some of these children worked in the cotton mill, but by this time, industrialisation had led to the development of the power loom and much larger machinery. Henry McMullen was an impoverished young Irishman who came to join the Irish community in Glasgow looking for work. This map shows the distribution of McMullens in Northern Ireland. According to his marriage certificate, Henry was born in the farmlands around Mackera, about halfway between Derry and Belfast in Northern Ireland. In 1829, Henry McMullen, then only 19, and Roseanne Fitzsimons, 21, were married in St Andrew's Catholic Church in Glasgow. Details of their marriage are shown here in the St Andrew's Marriage Register. This is St Andrew's Church, where Henry and Roseanne were married. Nicholas Fitzsimons had already been married here on 2 occasions, and all of his children had been baptised here. Situated on the River Clyde, St Andrews was probably a meeting place for the Northern Irish Catholics in Glasgow. Henry and Roseanne McMullen had 3 sons over the next 5 years. Daniel was born in Glasgow in 1830, and then my great-grandfather John 1 year later, also in Glasgow. The next son, Henry Jr., was born 3 years later in Belfast. Had the young family moved back to Ireland looking for work? Two years later, when Roseanne was 8 months pregnant with her 4th child, Henry was in Dublin, perhaps still looking for work. It is not clear whether his young family was with him at the time. On the 11th of April 1836, Henry drowned in the River Liffey, the main river flowing through Dublin. It is not known whether he was sober or intoxicated at the time. Was his death due to suicide, or was it a terrible accident? He was just 26 years old when he died. "12 days after Henry's death, Roseanne had a daughter whom she called Mary, and at the age of 29, Roseanne was left destitute with a very young family of 4. She returned to Glasgow, where some years later she married James Griffin, an Irish agricultural labourer who, like Roseanne's father Nicholas, had come from Northern Ireland to Glasgow looking for work. Roseanne had 3 more children with James, a son Peter, and 2 daughters, Roseanne and Margaret. Roseanne's 7 children all seem to have been very close, and they stayed together through many difficult times in the future. The sections that follow deal mainly with these 7 children of Roseanne Fitzsimons McMullen Griffin. Strangely perhaps, their old grandfather Nicholas appears to have preferred the company of this family to that of the later family that he fathered. He followed them across the world to Ballarat and then to Wollongong. Perhaps the reason for this was his close relationship with his daughter Roseanne. She seems to have been a resilient woman and a much-loved mother. All of her children named a daughter after her, and the name Rose has recurred down the generations. Of the 7 children, eldest son Daniel McMullen and second daughter Roseanne Griffin seem to have been the most colourful and feisty. I shall refer to this daughter Roseanne simply as Rose to reduce confusion with her mother. I imagine Daniel to have been the most energetic and the driving force of the family, initiating their move to the goldfields of Ballarat and later to the coal mines of Wollongong. I also believe that Daniel would have been an irascible character who, when things did not go well in Bellambi, deserted his brothers and sailed off to San Francisco, dragging his poor young wife all over the west coast of America looking for gold. Rose married very young to a tough young Englishman, Jack Floyd, who had jumped ship at Bellambi and who went on to run pubs and to sort people out in a pugilistic sort of way and to ferociously defend his wife's honour. Rose may have been a vivacious young woman, but she would also have lived a hard life in pubs, and after her husband's early death, she managed a slaughter yard and a dairy farm while raising 6 children. The other 5 McMullen and Griffin children seem to have been quieter characters, while also living very hard lives. My great-grandfather John, strangely enough, never lost his enthusiasm for coal mining, despite going bankrupt while managing a mine and then having to spend the rest of his life farming at Hartley Vale. His younger brother Henry was close to John, and he too wanted to continue as a coal miner, but instead became a selector farmer out west in Cowra before finishing his days with his younger sons in the Bellingen Coffs Harbour area. His sister Mary married German farmer Karl Braun and had a large family with him. Having no success on the goldfields, Mary and Karl became farmers, supplying the Victorian goldfields before moving north to Cowra to farm close to her brother Henry's farm. Younger half-brother Peter Griffin spent all his days as a coal miner. In his later decades, living in Newtown while commuting to Bulli and acting as a prominent trade union official there. Youngest sister Margaret, while living with her brother Henry on a farm at Berrima, met a young Irish widower, John Gorman, from Queensland, with 2 young children, and still only 19, Margaret married this man and went north to a rural property over 100 kilometres from Rockhampton, where she raised John's 2 children as well as another 12 of her own. Returning to the family before they left Scotland, the Scottish census of 1851 shows that most of the McMullen Griffin family was living in outer northwestern Glasgow near the coalfields. The family had moved from the cotton industry to the coal industry, and the brothers would remain committed to coal mining for the rest of their lives. At this time, Daniel, 20, John, 19, and Henry, 17, were all coal miners, while their half-brother Peter, 10, also worked in the mines, pushing carts. Staying at home, Mary, 15, was the housekeeper, looking after her half-sister Margaret, who was 3, and her grandfather Nicholas, who was 87. It is not clear where the other members of the McMullen Griffin family were at the time of this census. Work in the coal mines during this time was primitive and dangerous. Young boys were employed to push carts full of coal and to squeeze through openings too narrow for adults. Each of the brothers probably worked in these coal mines from about the age of 9. There are family stories passed down of young Henry pushing coal barrows as well as tap dancing to keep warm. For poor coal miners in Scotland, the discovery of gold on the other side of the world, first in California and then in Australia, must have seemed like a great opportunity to improve their lives. In 1854, Daniel McMullen, now 24 years old, decided to sail to the rich gold diggings of Ballarat and to check out the prospects there for his brothers. He left Glasgow on the Glen Roy in March 1854. The journey was a long one, taking 3 months. Daniel came to Australia as an unassisted immigrant and hence paid for his own fare. With the support of his brothers, he must have been saving for many months as he planned this trip. Daniel reached Geelong, the gateway to the goldfields in Victoria, in June 1854. Strangely, there is no record of Daniel ever travelling to the goldfields. He probably contacted his brothers at this time to tell them to join him while he waited for him in Geelong. 6 months later, at the end of 1854, the brothers John, Henry and Peter left the port of Greenock west of Glasgow for Australia. With them were their sister Mary and their 90-year-old grandfather Nicholas, whose age was officially recorded in the shipping records as 69, so that he would be allowed on board. The McMullen group sailed on the Echo, arriving in Geelong in 1855, in April. Like Daniel, they came as unassisted immigrants, all paying their own fares. It says a lot for the initiative and enterprise of these young people that they could save up the money for their own fares at a time when many immigrants relied on government support for their fares. Very soon after their arrival, they all travelled out to the goldfields at Creswick, north of Ballarat, except for Daniel, who stayed in Geelong working as a labourer. Perhaps he had become disillusioned with the prospect of them finding gold. The other brothers only stayed at Creswick for a year or two before moving with their brother Daniel to Bellambi near Wollongong. Their sister Mary stayed on at the goldfields around Ballarat, having met a German farmer, Karl Braun, whom she later married. In 1857, when the four brothers moved from the goldfields of Ballarat to the coal mines of Bellambi, they were still young men. Daniel was 27, John 26, Henry 23, and Peter only 16. Surprisingly, instead of getting jobs as coal miners, these young men became managers of the newly opened Bellambi coal mine, owned by Thomas Hale, a Sydney jeweller and businessman who had moved to Woonona north of Wollongong looking for business opportunities there. Hale knew little about coal mining, but he had thrown himself into this venture with great enthusiasm. In 1857, Hale built a tramway from the colliery in the hills west of Woonona down to the beach at Bellambi, where a substantial jetty was built to transfer the coal to waiting ships. Ships such as this one, the Helen, transported the coal extracted from Hale's mine up to Sydney. While the McMullen brothers were managing Thomas Hale's coal mine, the last members of the McMullen Griffin family emigrated from Glasgow to Sydney. James Griffin was now 57, his wife Roseanne 53, and their two daughters, Rose 13 and Margaret 11. They travelled straight down to Bellambi to join the brothers, and James Griffin ran a farm there. Roseanne's father Nicholas, now 96, joined them on James' farm, but within a month he was killed by a falling tree in a tragic accident where he was watching James clearing the land. In 1859, Daniel married a 16-year-old girl, Sarah Kearns. Sarah was the daughter of an ex-convict, Michael Kearns, a farmer living at Fig Tree. He had earlier been transported from Wicklow in Ireland for stealing 3 cows. Late in 1860, Daniel and Sarah had their first daughter, whom they named Rose, after Daniel's mother. Daniel always seems to have been a restless fellow, and in 1862, perhaps dissatisfied with the coal mining work that the brothers were doing at Bellambi, he sailed with his wife Sarah and baby daughter to San Francisco, looking for new opportunities. In 1862, San Francisco was a bustling and often lawless city, with hordes of fortune seekers streaming through the city on their way to the goldfields nearby. Daniel and Sarah had 3 more sons there, the first one named Henry after Daniel's father, but he died before he reached the age of 2. In 1869, Daniel decided to take his young family to Soledad, 200 kilometres south of San Francisco. During the 1860s in Soledad, there was gold and copper mining. However, Daniel doesn't seem to have been very successful here, as within a year the family was back in San Francisco, where Daniel became a naturalised American citizen in 1870. The following year, Daniel and his young family, now numbering 5 children, aged between 11 and a few months old, headed out 200 kilometres east to Amador, another gold mining area. Again, Daniel seems to have had little success. By the late 1870s, 15 years after his arrival in California, Daniel had turned his hand to farming at San Gregorio, 65 kilometres south of San Francisco. He was now in his late 40s, while Sarah was in her late 30s, having produced 8 children. Daniel's last move was a big one to Carbonado, a booming coal mining town 1,100 kilometres north in the state of Washington. This move took place in 1883, and the following year their last child was born. This picture of Dan was taken in his final years prospecting for gold in Carbonado. He looks like a tough old character, a man who had been dedicated to mining all of his life. He looks fit, but older than his 50-odd years. Daniel lived on in Carbonado for another 5 years before dying in 1889, aged 59. He had lived a very adventurous, though restless life. He probably left very little behind for his wife and 9 surviving children, who were aged between 29 and 5. Daniel's wife Sarah, and those members of the family who were still living with her, moved down to Tacoma, the nearest city in Washington state. The 1910 census, 20 years later, shows Sarah as living in a rooming house run by her daughter, Jenny. Sarah lived on in the area for another 27 years. She died in 1916, aged 73. Considering the travels of their father and mother, the majority of the children moved around very little, most living and dying around Tacoma in Washington state. Almost all of the boys were coal miners at some stage, usually in their younger years. They seemed to share the yearnings of their father and Australian uncles to discover gold or coal. 2 of them went north to Alaska to be part of the last American frontier-style gold rush in 1909. Returning to the other members of the McMullen Griffin family, a few years after elder brother Daniel left for California, his younger half-sister Rose married John Floyd in Bulli. Rose was only 16 and pregnant when she married John Floyd, who was aged 24. John Floyd had been born in Grafton in the Yorkshire Dales west of York, and he later served 12 years in the Royal Navy. In 1862, he jumped ship from the Dumfale Castle, which was taking coal from Bellambi to Shanghai. In all likelihood, this coal would have been from the mine managed by the McMullen brothers. The Illawarra Mercury later described John Floyd in an article as a true type of a John Bull Englishman and the most powerful bodied man in the Illawarra. Other sources described him as known for his short fuse. He fronted court a number of times for assault, culminating in the police opposing his licence renewal application in 1873. Jack permitted gambling and disorderly conduct in his pub, and, they said, was not a fit and proper person to conduct a public house, according to Wollongong's top policeman. He was given a warning by the magistrates not to allow his temper to get the better of him in future. A few years after their marriage, John Floyd became the licensee of the Woonona Hotel, and then 3 years later of the Railway Hotel, Bulli. During this time, John and Rose had 8 children, though 2 died as babies. According to the Illawarra Mercury, John took a lively interest in public matters. Among these interests was his opposition to public houses opening on Sundays, giving as his reasons for such opinion his desire to have Sunday off when keeping the Railway Hotel at Bulli. This last view might explain why John got out of the pub business to become a butcher. At the age of 40, John became a butcher, but within 2 years, in 1881, he was dead. After suffering from rheumatic fever for several weeks, he was taken to St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney, but shortly afterwards he died there of heart failure. The children of Rose and John were butchers and publicans, starting up what was described as a dynasty of beef and beer barons that lasted in the northern Illawarra till the middle of the 20th century. When their eldest son James died in 1930, the Illawarra Mercury described him as being one of a respected Bulli family. Rose Floyd was only 35 when her husband died. No doubt she had been living a hard life as a wife of an hotelier and mother of 6 children, most of whom were still quite young. A few years after John's death, she obtained a licence for a slaughter yard and kept pigs. She later ran a dairy farm. She is mentioned in the local paper as performing in amateur concerts till her late 40s. Clearly she was a feisty character. Rose never married again, and she died at Willow Farm, Bulli, at the relatively young age of 53 in 1900. The Illawarra Mercury reported that her funeral was very largely attended, and her remains were interred in the Anglican cemetery. Returning to the McMullen brothers, since 1857 they had been managing the Bellambi coal mine owned by Thomas Hale. Hale was having financial difficulties as a result of one of his ships being wrecked, as well as the miners striking for higher wages. Hale was able to ensure that the McMullen brothers paid the price for his difficulties. In 1863, the Bellambi mine was closed, and the McMullen brothers were declared bankrupt. After fixing up their debts, the McMullen brothers split up, going their separate ways. Newly married Henry McMullen went to farming in the Berrima-Mittagong area. Peter Griffin, also newly married, remained a miner, moving to the Newcastle mines around Hamilton. John McMullen moved to Hartley Vale, where he ran a farm while also developing a small coal mine there. Henry and his new wife Rosanna and 3 young children moved to a farm in Berrima. Henry hated farming, preferring to be a miner, but his wife Rosanna wanted her husband and family to be well away from mining. In 1868, Henry's 19-year-old half-sister Margaret was visiting the family on Henry's farm. During this time, she met an Irishman, John Gorman, visiting from outback Queensland, whose wife had just died, leaving John with two very young daughters. Within a short time, Margaret married John and went on to have a very large family with him. Margaret and John moved to Glenlee Estate near Campbelltown, where the Southern Railway line was being constructed. John worked there as a fettler and later as a farmer. The living conditions were very primitive, probably in tents or huts, and Margaret had 2 infant deaths there. Her mother, Roseanne, and father James came to help her, but they all soon decided to move to Sydney, probably for the health of the young family. They all moved to Redfern, living near Redfern Park. Margaret's husband John worked as a dairyman at Pine Villa Dairy Farm in Newtown, near Macdonaldtown Station. Margaret continued to have children, but now they were surviving. In 1882, James Griffin, the husband of Roseanne and father of Peter, Rose and Margaret, died of old age at 79. Margaret and John Gorman decided to move the 1,400 kilometres north, back to Bullborough near Rockhampton, where John had come down from. They travelled the long journey with their 7 children by steamboat and rail. The 75-year-old Roseanne moved to Hartley Vale to live with her son John McMullen and his young family. In Bullborough, John Gorman continued to work as a railway fettler and farmer. Margaret had 5 more children, making a family of 12 children, including 2 stepdaughters who were almost adults and who soon married locally. John Gorman died at Bullborough in 1912, just prior to World War I. Margaret lived on through the war till 1928, when she died, aged 79. Returning to Henry and Rosanna McMullen, they left their farm in Berrima in the early 1870s and moved with their 5 young children to Hartley Vale to work with elder brother John on the small coal mine there. 2 of their infants died in Hartley Vale and 2 more were born before Rosanna convinced her husband to move west, leaving coal mining and concentrating on farming. In 1876, Henry and a pregnant Rosanna took their family of 7 young children 200 kilometres west to the Cowra area. At first, they ran a store in the small town of Woodstock, but they soon took up a small farm in Walleye, north of Woodstock. Like many small farms at this time, Henry's farm was selected from the larger estates of the squatters, who bitterly resented these small farmers. On Henry's farm, there was no house, water or fences, and the wealthy squatter neighbours would often come at night and drive off their cattle. Henry and Rosanna farmed this land for about 25 years, by the end having a family of 9 children, the older ones becoming farmers in the local area. By the beginning of the 20th century, the younger children had grown up, and 2 of the youngest, Jim and Philip, went land hunting on the north coast of New South Wales, around Bellingen. They sent for Henry and Rosanna, who were now in their late 70s and who were too old for farming. Henry and Rosanna travelled by steamboat to Coffs Harbour, where they bought a house there. Henry grew vegetables, and Rosanna and her daughter Rose took in boarders and did dressmaking. Rosanna died at Coffs Harbour in June 1914, a couple of months before World War I broke out. Henry lived on for another 10 years, returning to live with his sons near Bellingen at a property called Valerie, named after a savage World War I battle in France, in which one of Henry's grandsons, Vincent Paslow, had been killed. After the war, Henry moved back to Coffs Harbour to live with his daughter Rachel and died there in 1924 at the age of 90. Now we turn to the story of Henry's younger sister, Mary McMullen, going back to the time of the gold rushes. In 1855, Mary accompanied her brothers, John, Henry and Peter, to the goldfields of Creswick, 20 kilometres north of Ballarat. When they decided to give up looking for gold and travel to Wollongong, Mary stayed in Ballarat, having met and become pregnant to Karl Braun, a German farmer. They had a daughter whom they called Rose Fitzsimons Braun, named after Mary's mother. In December 1859, Mary and Karl married in the gold rush town of Ararat, and Karl anglicised his name to Charles Brown. Unfortunately, their infant daughter died 6 months later. Charles worked for some time as a dairyman, but then decided to try his hand at prospecting for gold. During this time they had 3 more children. Charles had no luck looking for gold, and so they took up farming again. They moved to Avoca in Western Victoria and spent years farming there while Mary had 4 more children. In 1880, Mary's brother Henry got in touch with Mary and Charles to suggest they come north to Cowra to select land for a better farm there. Mary was now 44 and had 7 children, ranging in ages from Henry, aged 19, to Katrina, aged 6. Mary and Charles Brown set off overland for Cowra, 750 kilometres away. They travelled with 3 wagons, a water tank, and the elder boys on horses. It took 6 weeks to complete the journey. They named their new farm, which was about 10 kilometres from Henry McMullen's farm, Avoca Valley. Charles and Mary Brown did not move again after they had come to Cowra, and 6 of their children remained in the area as farmers or farmers' wives. When Charles died decades later, in 1917, the local newspaper commented that he had many grandchildren and great-grandchildren living in the area. It also stated that he had been born in Holland rather than in Germany. The fact that he was a German could not be admitted in a country at war with Germany. His wife, Mary, died in 1926, aged 90. Peter Griffin, younger half-brother of John and Henry McMullen, had lived and worked with John and Henry as a miner all of his life, till they all became bankrupt in Bellambi in 1863. Peter, still only 22, had only just married Margaret Sullivan, a convict's daughter. Over the next 7 years living at Bulli, Peter and Margaret had 3 children before moving to Newcastle in 1870. Peter worked as a coal miner in Newcastle at a place called Borehole, now the suburb of Hamilton. Here they had another daughter named Margaret after her mother. Either they did not like the conditions at Borehole or their little daughter had health problems, as within 2 years Peter and Margaret moved back to Darlinghurst in Sydney. Here their problems continued. Baby Margaret died at 16 months, while their next child only lived for 11 weeks. Fortunately, later children survived and lived on to adulthood. Surprisingly, Peter continued as a coal miner for the rest of his life, commuting to Bulli while his family stayed in Sydney. Still only in his mid-30s, he became president of the Bellambi Bulli Benefit Society, a mutual benefit society for miners. In 1874, he is mentioned in the local press as chairing a meeting at the Bulli Railway Hotel, the one owned by his brother-in-law Jack Floyd and his sister Rose. Peter is also mentioned frequently over the years as agitating for the local miners' interests. In 1887, Peter was listed in the Herald as one of the miners out of work as a result of the Bulli mine disaster, in which 81 miners were killed, including many boys aged between 14 and 16. The Bulli mine closed down for a year, and Peter, now in his late 40s, relocated to Helensburgh Colliery, where he seems to have worked for the rest of his life. Despite his misfortunes, Peter must have been financially successful, as in 1883 he was able to purchase a newly built house in Alice Street, Newtown, into which his family moved. He called the house Kelvinside, after the area near Kelvin Grove Park in Glasgow, where he had lived as a boy with his elder McMullen brothers. This house in Alice Street, which is still standing, stayed in the hands of Peter Griffin's family up until recently. Peter died in 1904, aged 64, after a long and painful illness. Like many other coal miners, he died of miner's lung, an accumulation of carbon in the lungs from inhaled coal dust. His funeral was a large one, as he was a member of the Court Robin Hood, an intriguingly named friendly society with a membership of 500,000 members throughout the English-speaking world. The local members of this organisation marched through King Street, Newtown, as part of Peter's funeral procession. John McMullen, my great-grandfather, spent 4 to 5 years sorting out the problems of bankruptcy that he and his younger brothers had become embroiled in as a result of being swindled by the Bellambi coal miners' owner, Thomas Hale. After this, in about 1868, he moved to Hartley Vale, west of the Blue Mountains and near Lithgow. John set up a farm in Hartley Vale, while at the same time continuing to look for coal in the hills surrounding his farm. In about 1870, John's brother Henry and his young family of 5 children joined him there, but after about 5 years they moved west to farm at Cowra. At about the same time, John, now 41, married Catherine Brady, the eldest daughter of a neighbouring farming family. Catherine was 32 and seems to have been married previously at a much younger age. Her parents, Hugh and Bridget Brady, had migrated from Central Ireland in 1841, more than 30 years earlier. They had travelled by bullock dray over the Blue Mountains and settled in Little Hartley. They were some of the earliest to settle in the Hartley Valley, and they raised a family there of 7 children. John McMullen mixed farming with coal mining, always retaining his passion for coal mining. The farm, about 700 acres and named Reedy Gully, was surrounded by steep hills on 3 sides. It was in the sides of these hills that John looked for coal while maintaining a dairy, planting an orchard and growing vegetables. Between 1875 and 1888, John's wife Catherine had 4 sons, the third of whom, Henry, was my grandfather. In 1882, John's 76-year-old mother, Roseanne, came to live with the family. At about this time, Catherine was pregnant with a 5th child. When she was born in 1883, they named this daughter Rose. She became the 5th daughter or granddaughter named after Roseanne. Roseanne Griffin lived with the McMullen family at Hartley Vale for another 7 years, finally dying in 1890 at the age of 83. She had been an extraordinary mother and grandmother, travelling with her family over vast distances, coping with a range of tragic circumstances and showing enormous resilience. In particular, she had been a source of strength to her daughters and daughters-in-law in that terrible period between 1871 and 1876, when 7 of her grandchildren had died very young. In the end, she had more than 60 grandchildren. John McMullen lived on with his family at Reedy Gully, farming and mining coal till 1898. He tried to sell his coal locally, but experienced a lot of opposition from the larger coal producers in the area. His death certificate described him as a dairyman without any reference to his coal mining, but like his brothers Daniel, Henry and Peter, he retained his passion for coal mining to the end, passing it on to his sons, including my grandfather Henry. In July 1898, against the advice of his son, my grandfather Henry, John was driving home from Lithgow in a new buggy with a touchy horse. In a hilly section of the road called Brown's Gap, John was thrown from the buggy and subsequently died of his injuries. A sad end for a grand old man. John McMullen, whose father had died in the River Liffey in Dublin, who had worked as a very young man in the mines of West Glasgow and followed his elder brother to Victoria looking for gold and managed, with his brothers, a failed coal mine in Bellambi, finally passed away on a farm at Hartley Vale.